So good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. I've just had the honour of following the speech of the Finance Minister, so I thought this morning I would spend a bit of time sharing some findings from a recent report that we actually wrote for Finance Ministers. So the Japanese presidency of the G7 recently commissioned us to do a report on economic welfare beyond GDP. And the goal here was really to look at policies to pursue welfare in a very broad sense. So the report itself has three main components. There's a part that is all about the limitations of GDP for measuring economic welfare that we've already heard very well spelt out. The second part is some data. And then the third part is all about the steps that OECD countries are taken or have taken so far to integrate well-being dimensions into policy strategies in a much more systematic way than we've ever seen previously. So it's mostly this final section that I'll talk about today. And for anyone who likes reading long reports rather than listening to short presentations, I've added a few links there on the slide. So the first thing to remark on is the huge progress we've seen in the last 10 or 20 years in terms of efforts to go beyond GDP in measuring the progress of societies. So today, more than 2/3 of OECD countries have developed well-being frameworks, development plans, or surveys with multidimensional well-being focus. And as you can see from just how crowded this slide becomes when we move from left to right, this activity has really accelerated in the last 10 years or so. So I'll pause for just a moment to explain what I mean by a multidimensional well-being framework, because we heard from the Minister that it's very important to be very precise, and that is indeed what the OECD has been investing in for now more than 20 years in terms of what are the metrics that we need in order to understand people's well-being. Now, I should say that at the moment, I heard Richard Layard earlier say we need a single metric. At the moment, where we tend to land in OECD countries is more of a dashboard approach. And here I've got the OECD's wellbeing framework because that shares many commonalities with the frameworks that we see across OECD countries. So this is just an example here to highlight a few of the kind of key components of these multidimensional frameworks. So the first thing to emphasize really is there are three blocks, in a sense, to this approach. One is to focus on current well-being here and now. A second block that you see on the right is looking at inequalities in well-being. So what is the distribution of outcomes? This is core to pretty much every well-being approach that we see. Finally, there is a strong emphasis on sustainability within most well-being frameworks. So within the OECD context, we talk about resources for future well-being, and maybe because we're economists, we talk a lot about capitals. We identify natural capital, human capital, economic capital, and social capital. That's not to say that we put monetary values on all of these things. We include physical measures in the capitals. But what we're trying to get at is that these are stocks of resources that we need to conserve for future generations. And indeed, in the measures that we use, we look at stocks, flows, risk factors, and resilience. So as you can see in current well-being, we've got several different dimensions. These are focused on people, not just the economic system. We look at inequalities as well as averages. We look at both objective and subjective aspects of people's lives. So if you want to understand people's well-being, you do need to ask them, how is life going for them? And that's precisely the metrics that Richard was talking about earlier. So they are included in our framework and in the majority of frameworks. And indeed, we've done a lot of work as an organisation to try and advance the measurement of subjective well-being in particular, but also trust, the quality of the work environment, some of the work on the joint distribution of income, consumption and wealth. The OECD has been writing guidelines in this area so that countries can come to a consensus on how we approach measurement. Because again, as we've heard this morning, we do need to sort of move towards a consensus position internationally for these metrics to really get embedded firmly. So as I said before, we've got both current well-being and resources for future well-being, and this is really important. And I think it's also really important to say that this is a sustainable development approach. Well-being and sustainable development are not sort of opposites to one another. They are very much a common approach. So just to highlight also, when we analyse the content of national well-being frameworks, they many of them share a common conceptual core that is well captured by this OECD wellbeing framework that I showed before. So this figure shows the concepts that are included in the OECD's wellbeing framework and national frameworks. We've got a focus on G7 countries on the left. We've got selected OECD countries in the middle there, including Iceland. And then we've got a couple of selected international organization efforts as well, just to balance and to show the other actors in this space. So the important thing, I think, the important impression that hopefully this slide will lead you is that the large majority of national initiatives do converge towards the types of wellbeing indicators and domains that the OECD approach looks at. There is a focus on resources for future wellbeing. Even if sustainability isn't the language that is used, there is a really strong focus across the vast majority of these initiatives. And the other thing to really highlight is also that inclusion and equal opportunities doesn't tend to be a separate dimension of measurement. It tends to be a cross-cutting theme throughout. So we don't just see a dimension that looks at income inequality, for example. What we see is looking at health inequalities, looking at inequalities in safety, looking at inequalities in environmental exposure to pollution, this sort of thing. So inclusion and equality of opportunity is really a cross-cutting theme. It's not a single dimension. The last thing I should probably just explain is there's one or two gaps on this slide. You see that France has got a number of gaps. This is partly just a function of the fact that the French have focused on 10 indicators. They call it the new indicators of wealth. And when you only have 10 indicators, it's quite hard to cover 15 different dimensions. The other thing to highlight is you can see knowledge and skills is a bit of a gap. This is really more a function of how the OECD is defining knowledge and skills, because education and educational attainment is something that we look at in the context of human capital, and the vast majority of national frameworks do include measures of education and educational attainment. So it's not that education is missing, it's that we embed it in the course of our human capital measures. Now, another much simpler way to describe the convergence across these different initiatives comes from a paper that was recently written by Liz Ziedler at the Centre for Thriving Places, together with a variety of co-authors. And they looked across many, many different initiatives happening in countries and within the UK. And they summarised this as economies that are thriving, fair, and green. So if I were to pass the OECD framework according to these categories, so just to try and explain how the framework I showed before fits into these boxes here. Under thriving, we'd have aspects of material well-being, so things like income, work, housing. We'd have things that sometimes get called quality of life, so things like health, subjective well-being, knowledge and skills, environment quality. And importantly, we would have community relations, which, again, we've heard about a lot this morning, and it's core to most of these frameworks. So social connectedness, work-life balance, safety, civic engagement. In the FAIR block, this is really about the distribution of outcomes, but also the distribution of opportunities and social mobility more broadly. So as I said before, this is often a cross-cutting theme, and in the OECD, we look at a variety of different sort of population slices, if you like, to try and understand how outcomes vary for different people. So how people's experiences of well-being vary, whether that's geographical variance, whether that's differences between men and women, between different age groups, between different education groups. At the OECD, we focus on international data, so the ways in which we can slice the data are limited. But again, many national level initiatives can go a lot further than we can in terms of looking at the distribution of outcomes among vulnerable groups. Finally, if we look at the green component, within the OECD approach, as I said before, sustainability has a human component, a social component, an environment component, and an economic component. But obviously under green, we're looking not only at climate change, but also biodiversity, a variety of, again, technical indicators around things like soil and water quality, how we process waste, looking at where our energy comes from. And we look at aspects of ecosystem services, which is basically how does the environment support people's well-being. So, obviously, the purpose of developing all of these measurement frameworks is not to improve measurement. It is to deliver better policy outcomes. It's to deliver better lives for people, and also better policy processes. And that's not the OECD saying that. This slide it actually comes from the Department of Finance in Canada, and it comes from their Quality of Life strategy written in 2021. And they highlight these 6 potential benefits of a well-being approach in policy. So 6 potential benefits of not only measuring well-being better, but starting to integrate well-being into policy in a more systematic manner. So they emphasize, of course, number 1, better outcomes for people, focusing on what really matters for people's well-being, but also better decision-making processes within government. So aligning decision-making in government with the outcomes that matter for people. Another core feature, and this is not only in Canada, but actually, again, in a number of national initiatives that we see, is a more long-term perspective. So again, putting sustainability issues at the forefront, looking at future generations' well-being, not only well-being today. Another considered co-benefit is greater horizontal alignment. So in many ways, these well-being frameworks, if you like, are kind of a vision for government, a vision of where we're trying to get to, that sets a very clear range of objectives in a way that the government departments then work jointly towards. Because most of the well-being outcomes that we identify in all of these frameworks, they're not the responsibility of only one government department. Or even if that outcome is the responsibility of one government department, they need help from everybody else to achieve that outcome. So this is about shifting to a mentality of shared responsibility for well-being outcomes across government departments and putting in concrete structures in place to encourage collaboration across government departments. Again, this is not new. This is not unique to well-being. Government departments have been trying to collaborate for years because they know it leads to better government, better outcomes. But if you like, well-being is a structure and a framework that can facilitate that. It's in a way, it's providing an architecture for those shared conversations. Another theme that the Canadians identify here is continual improvement. So an iterative process where we're moving towards better forms of government and being really honest and open about the challenges along the way and being clear that this is a long-term objective for government, but it takes time to implement and embed, and it needs to be implemented with a spirit of continual improvement. Finally, something that a number of countries have also identified is the benefits of a well-being framework or a well-being approach to strengthen democratic dialogue. So both in terms of transparency and accountability that we've heard about previously, so being able to sort of say what is being delivered for society, but also actually in terms of how we define success. A number of national governments with wellbeing frameworks have had a very deep citizens consultation process to develop the framework. But over and above that initial kind of help us design our metrics, there is a role for citizens and citizen participation in actually embedding these approaches in policy decision-making. So how do we better connect people with the systems that serve them? There can potentially be a role for wellbeing frameworks here, not least because wellbeing frameworks help be much more explicit about the potential trade-offs involved in a particular policy decision. And that can then support, again, a democratic dialogue with stakeholders about how we choose to resolve the trade-offs across the different parts of the framework. So, the heart of the paper was really examples of policy practice from around the OECD. Now, we group these here into 4 particular categories of activities. So first of all, the paper looks at some examples of where countries are aiming to introduce well-being evidence to some extent in the context of budget processes or in fiscal strategies. So that's sort of the medium to long term. And it's important to say here that not all countries on this list are moving at the same speed or going into the same depth, but this variety in itself is bringing a lot of insights on the enabling factors. So again, we heard this morning that we should have lots of experiments. That is actually what is happening in OECD countries. We are seeing lots of experiments. They're all approaching this slightly differently. We don't yet have the kind of golden rules for how to do well-being budgeting, for example, but we've seen lots of different approaches emerging. Again, different speeds, different depths. Another example that we've looked at is national performance frameworks, or using a well-being framework to determine key performance indicators for governments, or indeed national coordination strategies. So this question of aligning across government ministries. A number of OECD countries have also looked at policy appraisal and evaluation tools. So this is much more about the technical toolkit that your analysts and economists in the civil service might be using to support decision-making by ministers. So this is really getting into the how of generating evidence and analysis for decision-making. Finally, we've looked at embedding mechanisms, so whether that's legislation and accountability structures, so we've seen that, for example, in Italy, New Zealand, Wales, and Scotland, or whether it's capacity building and evidence gathering, or indeed having coordinating bodies. So I think we heard about the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, a sort of a way of supporting the civil service in terms of making the laws actually happen in reality and giving good practice examples, but also where needed, challenging government. So just a couple of very brief examples. We've got the Canadian budget process. Now, Canada is already world famous for the gender budgeting that Canada's been developing, and indeed, in the context of that work, they've looked at a variety of different aspects of diversity, so they're no longer only looking at gender. But in 2021, Canada started also adding quality of life impacts to the budget analysis. So this, what you see on the slide, is actually an excerpt from the published budget document that shows some of the quality of life impacts that have been identified by this particular budget measure or budget initiative. And indeed, you can see that we've got quality of life impacts, but we've also got a distributional analysis by gender, by income distribution, by different generations. We've got a focus on marginalized communities and groups. So in Canada, the idea has been to really combine, rather than have sort of gender budgeting compete with other types of budgeting or green budgeting or well-being budgeting. In Canada, the idea is that you combine these approaches because well-being, as we've heard before, gender equality is a crucial part of that, but so is the environment. So rather than putting these in silos, the well-being approach is a way of kind of connecting across these different approaches. Again, we heard a little bit from Richard this morning about the United Kingdom Treasury's Green Book, and Richard described it much better than I will, so I will refer you to Richard's presentation for details of how well-being has been integrated into HM Treasury's decision-making processes. I've also here highlighted New Zealand Treasury's guidance for agencies on generating the wellbeing budget. So the wellbeing budget, again, I think Margriet is going to talk you through in much more detail, so I'm going to try not to talk too much about New Zealand. But one thing to highlight is that not only was wellbeing critical for identifying priorities for the budget at the highest level on the basis of evidence, but wellbeing was also used to analyse individual budget bids, individual budget measures that were being proposed for funding. So much like the Canadian example that I've shown, although there's very useful templates available. There's really useful practical material available online to understand how do governments really do this. A last type of well-being approach that I want to highlight is what in the OECD we've been calling applying a well-being lens. So looking at specific topical policy issues through a well-being lens to understand how does a well-being lens help us to generate better policy making. So an example that I've got on the slide here is a project all about well-being and mental health. Again, this is a priority that we've heard again and again this morning. And this project is about to conclude. We've already released one report and there'll be another report coming very soon. And there are really three components to this. One, of course, is better data. So how do we get better data on population-wide mental health status, both mental ill health, but also crucially whether or not people are thriving, whether or not they experience positive mental health. A second component of the work is looking at well-being, risk and resilience factors. And we heard Minister Linnout this morning from Luxembourg talking about the interconnectedness between health and other aspects of well-being. That is exactly what we're doing in this project for mental health. So we're looking at the linkages between people's economic, social, environmental and relational realities and how that impacts people's mental health, but also how good mental health can support these other objectives for government. So again, really looking at that interconnectedness. Finally, one part of this project is much more practical, looking at lessons learned from policy initiatives. So both whole of government strategies for wellbeing and mental health, but also strategies that focus specifically on the interlinkages between mental health and, for example, poverty, or the interlinkages between mental health and the environment that people live in. So this final report will have practical examples of policy steps that we know have worked in government contexts. Last couple of conclusions that I want to make. First of all, there is no single way of using wellbeing evidence in policy. There's no one sort of golden rule or book you can follow yet, apart from Richard's book. So we've seen, for example, in the context of budgeting, well-being is being used in a reporting context, so really to set the context of the discussions and the debates. We've seen that move through to things like formal parliamentary debates on well-being evidence. We've seen, as I mentioned before, sort of requiring inter-ministry collaboration, particularly through the budget process. We've seen ex-ante assessments of well-being impacts of budget initiatives, which basically just means before you go ahead and run this policy, what is it going to do for people's well-being? So trying to put some evidence around that. We've seen a well-being perspective in some of the final resource allocations. So what I was talking about earlier in terms of how these decisions are actually made, how is well-being evidence integrated? We've seen a little bit of ex-post assessment of the impact of budget measures on people's well-being. And finally, this is definitely an emerging area, is looking at the baseline budget. So very often budgets, what is shiny and new is the new money, the new spending. But it's really important to also look at the pre-existing spending, the other part of the iceberg under the surface, to say, well, how right across government, how is our baseline spending contributing to people's well-being? So, in conclusion then, building well-being into policy requires a solid ecosystem of tools, processes, and incentives. On tools, we need common measurement frameworks, or certainly common frameworks, analytical and decision-making tools, so adapting things like cost-benefit analysis so that it's capturing more than just economic impact. Tools like legislation to help embed this over time, coordination mechanisms within government. We need processes, so processes of cross-government collaboration, civil service capacity building, because we're really talking about a real shift in what we're asking of civil servants. That takes time, it takes resources, and it takes a real change also in leadership. We're looking at things like public and stakeholder engagement, and again, engagement of politicians. There's real variety in terms of whether or not this issue is speaking to politicians yet, and of course they are key to the decision-making process and key to shifting government, the way that government works. Finally, incentives, I've mentioned some of these already, but accountability mechanisms, strong leadership, again, investment in cross-department programs, better decision-making, and of course, improved outcomes. That is the most motivating of all. All of this, of course, I would say, as the OECD, needs to be underpinned by a strong evidence infrastructure, and that's part of what we've been working at the OECD to try and build. The Finance Ministers and Central Bank Governors meeting happened in May, and our report was developed in order to inform their discussions. I've got a very long piece of text on this slide just detailing some of the communiqué that resulted from those discussions. So this is something that's agreed by members of G7 countries. So welfare cannot be fully captured by a single aggregated indicator such as GDP. The multidimensional aspects of welfare were underscored by G7 ministers. G7 ministers agreed that policymakers need to follow multidimensional indicators for measuring welfare, and they need to explore operational tools to reflect such indicators in policymaking. Finally, policymakers need to consider how these indicators can be brought in a practical and effective manner, including through budget compilation and performance frameworks. So these are the outcomes of G7 finance ministers and central bank governors' discussions. One very practical way to continue these conversations among all countries, not just G7 countries, will be this new OECD initiative. So we're creating a knowledge exchange platform on wellbeing measurement and policy practice. And the idea is we're going to develop a series of tools, but also facilitate conversations among the practitioners who are trying to do this now, and also those who are watching this from the side thinking, well, if we want to do this in our own national context, what are the lessons we can learn? So the idea here is that we want to sort of provide a strong support network for the governments that are trying to initiate all of these different experiments and see what lessons we can distill. So thanks very much, and I think at this point I hand over to Marguerite.